and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Simon spoke to Anna Codrea-Rado, who is a campaigner for freelance writers' rights.
So Anna's profile has really taken off in the last year or so on the back of a campaign she started called Fair Pay for Freelancers, which is aimed to improve the often difficult lot of freelance writers and journalists. And she's also set up a series of events and an excellent newsletter, all aimed at improving conditions in this space. It's a really interesting episode, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'm here with Anna Codrea-Rado. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you on. Could you start by telling us when you decided to become a fearless campaigner for freelance rights?
I don't think I ever necessarily thought I would become a campaigner. It kind of not exactly happened by accident, but pretty much immediately after I went freelance, I started getting quite frustrated with a lot of the payment issues around being freelance. And
like not being paid.
Yeah, pretty much not being paid late, just being mistreated by companies, all of that kind of stuff. And I started thinking, like, is there something that could be done about this? And I sort of spun this idea of launching literally a Google Doc with not my outrage, but all of the problems that I saw with freelancing. And it was when the women's website, shut down and left pretty much all of their freelancers out of pocket, and also their staffers as well. But freelancers had sort of invoices dating back months that were unpaid.
And then justified it with an emoji.
Yeah, the winky face emoji. Yeah, exactly. It was really heinous, that. And anyway, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. So I launched my Fair Pay for Freelancers campaign, which is, as I said, it's literally a Google Doc, and it's a letter calling on the media to pay its freelancers fairer, better and faster.
And did that predate FJ&Co, or was that kind of running already by that stage?
So FJ&Co is my platform for freelance journalists. Okay. And it kind of, I guess, FJ&Co launched officially around about the same time that I launched the campaign. I'd been putting on events and doing my newsletter for quite a while before that, but FJ&Co is essentially the culmination of all of that work and formalizing it and taking it to the next step. And I think I kind of launched the two roughly around the same time.
And I want to come back in more detail to the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But could you tell us a bit about what your background was prior to that and your entry into journalism and so forth?
So starting at the very beginning, I pretty much knew I wanted to be a journalist when I was at university.
Okay.
I found myself accidentally involved with the student paper.
Accidentally how?
Well, so I saw a piece in one of the student papers. So I was at university at Durham, and there was a piece in one of the student papers about a fellow student in my year who had allegedly, according to the paper, tried to kill himself. And the reporting was absolutely horrendous. They pulled pictures from his Facebook, and the way it was written was just, I didn't realize it until I researched it, but completely counter to all of the guidelines, all of the reporting guidelines on how you should cover a suicide or a attempted suicide. And I ended up writing an opinion piece in one of the other student newspapers saying just what a travesty the state of student journalism is in if these are the kinds of stories that are running in student papers. And the response to that piece was really, really great. The student involved actually wrote to me and thanked me basically for drawing attention to the issue. And I ended up then working on the student papers and really, really enjoying it and sort of deciding, okay, I want to be a journalist now. But when I graduated in 2009, it was right in the middle of the recession. So I I decided to take any job that I could, which was predominantly writing, but I wasn't fussed about what that actually meant and whether that was for a newspaper or a magazine. I just took any job that I could find, and it ended up being an editorial assistant on an alumni magazine.
Okay.
So
For Durham?
No, for Imperial College.
Okay.
So technically a marketing job, but it was actually a really great experience because I got to write features, I got to edit them. Also, it was a magazine, the operation was me and my boss, so I got to see the whole process of what involves putting together a magazine, and it was actually a really, really great experience. And at the same time though, I was freelancing, I wasn't getting paid, for a number of different places.
Literally freelancing.
Exactly. For a number of different places, mainly music blogs, but then at some point I started writing for The Guardian. They had a careers blog, and I started writing about what it's like to be a graduate in the recession, from a careers perspective. And then at some point I decided to go and do my master's in America. It was prompted by the fact that the alumni department I was working for was going through a restructure, and my job was at risk of redundancy. Looking back on my whole career now, I realise redundancy kind of has made is a recurring theme. But anyway, I actually didn't lose my job in that round of redundancies, but it did give me a kick up the arse to think, what am I doing working in an alumni department? No shade to the alumni department, but it just wasn't what I wanted to be doing. I wanted to be a quote unquote real journalist.
Was there like key metric how much money was donated?
I think so, yeah. But that was on the fundraisers, so I'm sure the fundraisers had to. I'm sure
but
they
it
had
wasn't
targets.
Like each issue was like we got £17,000.
No.
Try harder, guys.
No. So the magazine was very much seen as a core offering to the alumni, to the sort of alumni members or alumni population. We didn't have to worry about whether or not it actually generated income. It generated donations. It was just kind of seen as our outward facing piece of literature, basically. So I wasn't actually asking anyone for money myself, although it did actually look like quite a fun job. But anyway, so I decided to go and do my master's in America because I'd never done a year abroad. I hadn't done a year out as a gap year. Columbia obviously has a really great reputation for its journalism program. And so I went out there.
Were you able to get financial support together?
No. So it's a very expensive course, and it's something that I wouldn't advise anyone do if it's going to put you in debt, because I don't think the industry right now is in a position where you would ever recover that money over the course of your career. So yeah, I went out to Columbia. I went out to New York to Columbia University, and then did a year after that at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, researching the future of journalism and the impact digital and the internet has on journalism, which was really, really fascinating.
And what was your experience at Columbia? And I went there as well a bit earlier. We were talking off air about that. How did you find that experience at both journalism school and American journalism school?
I absolutely loved my year at Columbia. I ended up going back to America later on. So I was there, did the year at the journalism school, and then I did the fellowship, and I came back to London, and then I went back to America to work out there. And the year that I was a student at Columbia was one of the greatest years of my whole life, I would say. I found that going to a city like New York as a journalism student is, you just see a side of New York that you would never get to see just in any other capacity. I had really fantastic professors and really, really learnt so much that I definitely still use today in my career. All that being said, I am fully aware that I also paid for a Rolodex of contacts, and I do feel that those sorts of courses, they can encourage more of the elitism that we already see in the media, and I'm very, very aware of that. I'm aware that I am part of that problem. That being said, at that time, there were no trainee schemes available because there was being so many cuts into newsrooms that all of the trainee schemes had been frozen. And I was caught in, like all of my cohort from that year, caught in this catch-22 of the very few jobs that were available, you were somehow expected to have all of this experience, but there were no mechanisms to train you because those schemes were closed. And I got all of that training that I needed at Columbia.
I mean, the thing I found about Columbia, I always had a fantastic time there. What I found in some ways slightly difficult, and partly it was in terms of the scholarship that I went on, but that I had this amazing year and a half in America, and then I had to leave. So I'd spent a year and a half building contacts and connections, and I worked at the New York Times after that, and I had to go. And it was as though, I wasn't eligible for an American visa for 2 years and stuff like that. Were you able to negotiate that? Or because you then went back afterwards?
So a couple of my friends were in the same position as you were, and it's a really tricky one because... And I remember going through this kind of almost excruciating anxiety in my second year because I was not in that position. I was able to get a visa if I could find someone to sponsor me. And I remember going through this period of not knowing what would happen and do I want to stay? Will I be able to find someone to sponsor me? And I looked at all the different avenues. And what I concluded is, because it's America, if you have the money, you can find a way to make it work, apart from in the circumstance of the visa, the particular visa that you happen to be on. But for any other foreign or British student, at least, who comes to America, there are ways you can make it work. But it opens up a huge can of worms of, do I really want to emigrate to America? How long will I be here for? And I was in my early 20s, and I just remember it causing so much kind of such an internal dilemma for me. In the end, because I was at Columbia on a work visa, because at Columbia my second year was my employer.
Okay.
Actually, no, I was on the. They give you that basic
OPT, right?
Yeah. Which
optional practical training, listeners.
It is actually a fantastic. I don't know if it still exists. It's basically a green card for a year.
So what it means is that you have an opportunity to work legally if you studied in the US for the same period you've worked for. I think I didn't have it. I had something different, which was kind of equivalent, but a bit.
So you are. It was valid for a year. I don't know if it's valid for as long as you've done the course for. But in my case, it was valid for a year because the course was a year maybe, and you just have to work in the field that you studied in. I mean, it's very, very open, and you don't have to be necessarily tied to one particular employer. And some people kind of made it work as a freelancer, and the smart students went and worked for companies that would then sponsor them. So there were some other international students who are still in America now who went and did a internship or an entry-level job on their OPT, and then that employer then sponsored them for a visa, and they stayed on. Because I was working at Columbia and Columbia was my employer, they don't sponsor visas at the level that I was at. So they would obviously sponsor kind of the professor level, but there was no way for me to stay on at Columbia. I was doing an internship at Quartz, and I remember going to my boss and basically begging for them to sponsor me for anything, and they just said, well, we're not. At that point they were an early stage startup, and they said we can't do that. I looked into whether or not I could get the freelancer visa, and it concluded it would be thousands of dollars, and I'd already obviously spent so much money on the course that I concluded the best thing to do was I felt like I had to go home basically.
And how was that?
Really, really tough. I really didn't want to. And it was...
You'd been there how long? 2 years?
2 years. But I remember I went to speak to... He was actually never... Actually, no, I did audit one of his classes, which basically means you're allowed to go and sit in on a class, but you're not technically taking the class. Very American thing. One of the professors that I had encountered, Mark Hansen, who teaches maybe it's outdated to call it computational journalism, but it's more convoluted than data journalism, basically. Anyway, I remember kind of complaining, kind of going into his office and being very distressed about the fact that I had to leave. And he said to me that that New York is one of those places that you can always come back to, and if it's not the right time for you to be there, your time will come, and this is, there will always be an opportunity to come back. It's not this sort of, this is the only ever opportunity you have. And I kind of thought, well, how is that possibly true? Because you need a visa. That doesn't sound true to me. But anyway, as it turns out, I ended up going back to the UK, and I really, really struggled with it because it felt as though the decision had been made for me rather than
I remember feeling like totally kind of uprooted, and I'd worked at the New York Times, I'd written front pages for them and things, and then I went to Turkey on this internship which I'd won from an overseas press club award, but it's kind of disorganized and everything, and my girlfriend was in New York and all of that, and it just felt like really like kind of start year zero, starting again.
And it is a shock because you asked earlier, I never actually answered this, but American journalism is very different to British journalism. If in many ways, to start with, how our newspapers are quite polarized politically. They don't have that in their papers. They have that on their TV channels. So their papers are a bit more kind of straight down the line. There's a much richer culture of long form writing, of investigative work. It's just much.
American journalists don't hate themselves.
They don't hate themselves. No, I mean some of the more literary ones do. The ones who kind of the sort of upper West Side writers do, but there's just, it's more of a profession than a trade, or at least that's its roots, I think. And coming back, I just felt quite disappointed at that I think it's changed a lot, but at that particular time there was such an entrepreneurial spirit in New York around the digital opportunities and all of these new digital publications that were springing up, and they were all based in New York. And when I came back to London, it just felt like a desert, and it, that wasn't happening. I think that's changed now. In fact, I know that's changed now. But anyway, as it happened, so I ended up going and working at The Guardian. I'd done a really short contract there just before I went out to New York, and I pretty much called my old boss and asked if there was any work going. Came in as a temp, more or less, did some shift work. That led to a job. And
at which bit of The Guardian?
So it was technically in what is now called Guardian Labs, which is actually their part of their commercial division, but I was working on the editorial side of the content that was funded by an external source. So it's basically their sponsored content, but they have journalists writing and covering and sort of editing and commissioning all of the actual pieces. I don't know how it works now. This was sort of in the earlier days of branded content. So I'm not sure what their arrangement is now. But what I was pretty much covering then was education stuff. And I'd also done some local, like some senior level local politics kind of stuff as well. And at that point, The Guardian then started expanding into America, and I got the opportunity to take a job in the US office, in the New York
office. Did you kind
office.
of hustle for that, or did it just...
I'm not sure, actually. I think I was highly encouraged to apply for this job.
Okay.
That came up because it was sort of within our broader department. So it wasn't in a complete, even though obviously it was in America, it wasn't in a completely separate part of The Guardian. It was just in the international office. So I think it was a case of I was encouraged to apply for it. And I got it. So I still had to go through this kind of internal application process, and I got it, and I moved back to New York, and that was their sustainable business section, which again, a large chunk of it was funded through external sponsorship. But the way those desks work is pretty much the same as how all of the other desks work. You know, the editors are setting the editorial agenda and commissioning from writers or writing pieces themselves. It's just that the funding for those projects is coming from a company rather than from advertising revenue or the payment of.
Did you feel that there was any that had an impact on the kind of lines that were being taken and things that were being written, or things that were not being written?
No, not at all. No. But those pieces, the thing is, all of those projects,
it's like Guardian Cities and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's Guardian Cities,
the development stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It's all of that. That all falls under. Although, this gets really into the weeds of it. There's Guardian Labs that do some of these projects, and then there's the Guardian Foundation, which does other projects. So I think Guardian Cities is a foundation project, and I think the difference is that it's supposed to be fully philanthropic, whereas the lab stuff is still a commercial and project. I'm not fully sure, and this has probably changed now because this is years ago. But the way those projects are set up, it's that you would never end up covering something that would be on the main news desk anyway. It's those Guardian type sections that are the hard news. So it's sustainable business, global development, things like that.
Was there any kind of caste system between people working on those desks and people on the sort of main desks? Did people want to get
100%? I really felt like I was a second-rate journalist, or there was I don't know whether it was a feeling, and a lot of my colleagues also in the kind of at my peer level felt the same, to the extent of whether or not we were actually being kind of considered that way from the main newsroom, or whether this was more of our own projection. I don't know. That being said, again, this may have changed because this was so many years ago. We were not part of the NUJ chapel, which sends quite a clear message that you're not a quote unquote real journalist.
And was that barrier permeable? Could you move from that silo into the main newsroom?
It was really, really hard, but I have seen increasingly my former colleagues who stayed, a lot of them are now on the main news team or in the sort of main editorial unit. That also is partly to do with the fact that all of that content that was being made by Guardian Labs seems to has been shrinking more and more anyway. And I think there were some really talented people who have just been absorbed and deployed elsewhere in the organisation.
Was it good to be back in New York?
Yes, it was great. It was really, really great. It was very different being there, working and getting to, even though it was The Guardian, it was still obviously an American company, and it was a culture shock again to be working with Americans who have a very, very different working style to Brits. And
could you give some examples?
They're a lot more, it's very cliche, but it is true. They are a lot more direct. They're a lot more comfortable talking about money, be that their salaries or be that a commercial project or whatever it might be, or how much rent they pay, which actually, to be honest, is actually really helpful when you're an expat and you're in a new city and you don't know how much rent you should be paying. They are, I think I would say the work-life balance in New York is a lot worse than it is here. There's a lot of FaceTime, so just being present in the office and being there really early and staying there really late. There wasn't much of a culture around Friday afternoon drinks, and there definitely wasn't a culture of finishing work at 5:00 and on a Friday and going to the pub. But I like to think that I try to take some of the there are a lot of advantages to working in that more direct, no bullshit kind of way. And
yeah, I agree with that.
So I've definitely tried to sort of integrate that into my working style that I've brought back home.
And you then moved to Vice?
Yeah, so then I moved to Vice. I was at The Guardian for about 1.5 years or 2 years, and then I moved to Vice to be the news editor on Thump, which is their now defunct electronic music vertical.
Okay.
So actually just...
It's kind of like broadly or things
Exactly,
like that, right?
yeah. And at that time, Vice had sort of sectioned off all of their different key interest areas into their own sort of little... they're not necessarily standalone websites, because they obviously do all fall under the Vice umbrella, but it was thump.vice.com, noisy.vice.com, etc., etc. Just before you arrived, I just saw a news article about how Noisy is going to be reintegrated into Vice.com, and I think Vice are now doing a U-turn on that, and they're bringing everything back into under one central umbrella. But at the time, that's how things were laid out, and I was the news editor, so I had news writers who were writing daily news stories. I was writing longer features and doing investigations, and I guess that was the first time I started to feel like a real journalist.
Why?
Because I was understood to be part of the core editorial team, and I definitely always felt like I knew I was a journalist when I worked at The Guardian, but I did internalize a lot of this kind of culture.
Two-tier sort of system.
Yeah, exactly. The second-rate member of staff problem that I had at The Guardian. And so I was at Vice in New York, and then I was actually supposed to be transferred to Berlin to move into a writing role. And I came back to London for a bit for the summer to kind of sort some things out at home before moving over to Germany. And that is when Vice announced that they were shutting down Thump and some other of their verticals. I think it was Vice Sports.
What year was this?
2017.
Okay.
So this was during the pivot to video moment.
Mm-hmm. That moment.
Yes, that infamous moment, which has now turned out to have been the reasoning behind putting all of that money into video has actually now been proven to have been based on false data as well.
And the idea was what? That no one reads anything anymore, but everyone watches video.
Yeah, and so had something to do with people wanting to watch video on Facebook.
Yeah.
And this was happening across the board. It wasn't just Vice. It was also Mic.com and Vox and BuzzFeed, I think, had a few redundancies during that time as well. So I went into work on a Friday. I got a call from Vice HQ in New York and was told, don't come back on Monday. And by this point, I had already been thinking about going freelance, because I had really wanted to be a reporter and a writer. And up until that point in my career, I had been editing. So I'd been an assistant editor at The Guardian. I'd been a news editor at Vice, and I really wanted just to be writing. Even though I was writing as well alongside all of the jobs I held, it was never the main point of my job. And I really had to push for me to get an opportunity to write. And I kind of thought, well, the worst has happened now. So
how did it feel when that call came?
It was quite... So I thought I was just being fired, that it was just me, because they don't... I guess it's to do with, the HR and legal language they have to use. I wasn't actually told that Thump was being shut down. There was all sorts of complicated jargon being used. I was quite confused as to what was happening. I thought it was just me, because they won't tell you, well, who else has been affected by this. And because I was out by myself in the London office, even though there were two members of staff on the London team, one had just so happened to coincidentally have handed in his resignation a couple of weeks beforehand, so he was moving on anyway. So, and the majority of my colleagues were all back in, so the rest of my colleagues were all back in New York, and I had no idea what was happening. And so, yeah, I thought I was being fired. And then I sat back at my desk, and I read on Variety, the kind of like, it's like an entertainment site, basically. I read on Variety that actually Vice had made a cut to 2% of its global headcount. So I thought, oh, okay, I'm being made redundant. I'm not actually being fired. I
think whatever you call it, it's part of a journalistic career, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
But how did you find the movement into the freelancing space?
Quite easy, actually.
Yeah.
I started, this happened on a Friday, and I was sat at my desk on the Monday, and going around saying, I'm a freelancer. I'm not unemployed. I'm self-employed.
And you decided that was the avenue you wanted to take.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't really know if I kept telling myself, I'll see what happens and let's see how this goes. I can always get a job if I have to. But in my heart of hearts, it was, no, I really, really want to make this work. I kind of, looking back on it now, I realized that I was really being fueled by every time I'd been turned down for an internal job as a writer, or that lost opportunity that I was supposed to be going on to this new role as a writer for Vice that never came. All of that I realized I had internalized and started to doubt my own abilities as a journalist and my own abilities as a writer, and actually trying to make it work as a freelancer for me has been so much about proving people wrong. So I think that's really what's been driving me. And
do you think that's healthy?
I think that now I recognize that. I think I'm not doing that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Maybe having recognized it
exactly.
You've kind of addressed it.
Yeah, I think it on the one hand it can just be ambition, really. That's just ambition. On the other hand, I do think it's important to be achieving things for their intrinsic value rather than trying to prove someone else
kind
wrong.
Of constantly contramundum.
Exactly. I'm increasingly, I know it's very trendy to have a nemesis, but I'm increasingly thinking that
I enjoyed your nemesis email.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and in that I pretty much say that I don't really have them anymore, and I'm not really thinking about what other people are doing.
I mean, I think I think it's a huge part of writing, but also working freelance is like, I think there's two forms of envy, right? There's like productive envy, which is, so-and-so has done a good piece of work and I'd like to emulate that. And then there's destructive envy, which is like, so-and-so's done a good piece of work, I'd like them to die. And
exactly.
That's, but you do have a choice between those. But I think in terms of like, what were the egregious things you were encountering then that stirred your campaigning muscles?
It really comes down to the pay issue for me, because...
Can you just, for maybe people who are listening who don't know how it works or doesn't work, can you just like lay out
sure. So
the situation?
So you'll pitch a piece. Let's say you'll pitch a piece to a newspaper or a magazine, and you'll agree the terms of that pitch. They'll say, yes, we like the idea. We want 800 words by, in 2 weeks' time. And the fee is however much the fee is. And
in the UK, there'll usually be no contract.
Yeah, there's usually no contract, or sometimes there's a writer's agreement, but actually if you read it, a lot of it is to do with the copyright, who owns the copyright, they do. Some of them do say, actually, here are our payment terms, and, we'll only pay after publication and all this kind of stuff. But usually there isn't a contract. And then you'll hand in the piece and you'll get the edits and you'll go back and forth, and this process can take weeks or it can take months depending on the nature of the story, how long it is, etc., etc.
Whether it's pegged to anything or...
Yeah, exactly. The worst is when you do an evergreen piece that has no news peg, because it just keeps falling through the cracks and sliding further and further down the priority list. And then,
until your editor is fired or the publication closes, in the sort of extreme example.
It does happen. And then you will invoice for a piece, but typically
post-publication
you will have to do it post-publication. So already you can be looking at quite a lengthy gap between that initial commission and the publication date, especially if you're writing for a magazine. Although some magazines are quite happy to accept the invoice a bit sooner, but plenty of them will only accept the invoice after publication. Anyway, and then...
But that can also be the beginning of another battle, right? Once the invoice has been submitted.
Exactly. Once the invoice has been submitted, then you wait for the money to appear. Well, first of all, you may have to battle with all of this nonsense paperwork. So you need to fill out this vendor form, or you have to use this payment system.
W8 Ben and all that.
Exactly.
Sort of thing,
if you're working for an American publication, you have to fill out a form that says you don't pay tax in America and all of this kind of stuff. And sign this piece of paper and sign your rights away and all of this. Anyway, and then you wait for the money to appear in your bank account, and then it doesn't. And then you start chasing and you don't hear anything back.
And then the fundamental issue is also the power dynamic here, right? That you're outside, you want more work and all that sort of thing.
And it's very tricky because you're typically talking about money and doing the chasing with the person who is commissioning you and also editing your work. So it's not like, say, if you're writing a book and you have an agent who can be the buffer between you and the publisher. You're doing this direct to, or if you're negotiating for a salary for a new job, you should be negotiating through HR rather than your hiring manager. But as a freelance journalist, you're talking about money typically with your editor, the person who's actually working on your work with you.
And there's also the issue of expenses reimbursement as well, right? Which means that you can, under some circumstances, be asked to front a lot of money yourself.
So if you go abroad on assignment, or even if you just take a train somewhere in the UK, which is pretty much the same cost as taking an international flight, you will have to pay for that, and you probably won't see your expenses until you file your invoice. Then you kind of sit out and you wait for you to be paid, and then inevitably you don't get paid, and then you start chasing, and then often. Eventually you'll be directed to a faceless accounts payable at publication.com email address, and you'll start emailing the accounts department, and they'll say, oh, actually this number is missing off your invoice, or something is wrong, or whatever the case might be.
And why do you think it is so bad?
I think it's many reasons. I think that for editors who've never freelanced, they don't know what it's like. They don't realize that this thing that's happening with one payment is happening across all of the other publications that you're working for. One journalist put it really, really well to me recently. She said that she's making more money now as a freelancer than she did in her staff job, but feels poorer because the money is just not coming in, and she's owed so much.
It's cash flow. Exactly,
it's a cash flow problem. So there's that you don't have the sympathies of the editors, who also as a former editor myself, I know that you're overworked and there's too many demands on your job. It shouldn't really be the editor who's dealing with the freelancer payments. There should be a dedicated person on each desk that's handling.
And what about the actual sums being paid as well?
I mean, they vary wildly. So that's the other thing, is that in the grand scheme of things, probably an editor's kind of looking at your £300 fee for a 1,000-word article and kind of thinking, well, what's that in the grand scheme of things? But
I think it might be worth just for listeners, like, kind of and we can do this jointly, but like laying out what gets paid for what. I mean, so like British newspapers generally pay 50 pence a word.
Yeah, like some of them do. I mean, so the Guardian's starting, I mean, obviously you can negotiate everything up, but the Guardian's per word rate is 31p for print,
which is not very much.
No, it's not. As it happens, the tabloids tend to pay more than the broadsheets.
And the Americans pay more than everyone.
Yes. So the Americans, you're looking at $1 to $2 a word.
Or more at the top ends of the magazine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But those are few and far between, and they're not, I find through doing all my work with FJ&Co and my newsletter, they're not super accessible to people who are just starting out, or who don't have those kinds of networks, or who haven't written for an American market,
or who don't have quite a lot of reporting experience as well.
Yeah,
I think in that
exactly.
Case. Yeah, they're not viable entry level.
Yeah, but a typical online piece, you're looking at £200-300 for like a sort of a flat fee for a feature that can be anything between 800 to 1,200 words.
Why do you think these rates are so low? I mean, is it simply a supply demand thing that lots of people want to write stuff?
No, I think it's a problem with the publications just not having big enough budgets, because their advertising budgets have been swallowed up by Facebook and Google. Although I don't have sympathy for these media publications, because this problem could be seen a long way off. And rather than try to correct course, they embraced Facebook by hiring massive audience growth teams that tried to beat the algorithm and encouraged Facebook sharing and encouraged Facebook as a way to bring traffic to their websites. This seemed, for some reason, this was completely divorced from the problem that Facebook was affecting the advertising model, and different revenue streams weren't being explored, and sort of solving this problem wasn't addressed until it's kind of too late. I mean, I don't think media is going to disappear, but it's a real problem that the budgets are small because the media companies aren't bringing in enough money through advertising.
But there's still money. If you look at, say, what a newspaper like Telegraph amount they would pay their columnists compared to the...
But those rates will... What will happen with those columnists is not that job will continue. Those people with those columns, once they stop writing them, be it because they move on or be it because they die in post, that money will not then be redistributed to another columnist. That budget will disappear. There are people who are, there are plenty of columnists who are kind of grandfathered in, and I don't think it's a case that, I think aspiring to have a very high paying column is as a career ambition,
it's archaic,
and it is that
I think that's not the point. I think the point I raised was like, I obviously the budgets have been stretched and so forth, but my view is that, like, publications could skimp on paying writers in a way they couldn't skimp on paying their accountants, or skimp on paying the people who print the thing or delivery or stuff like that, right? Because people want to write stuff.
I don't know, because to a large extent, so many editors complain about the quality of writing. So I don't actually buy this argument that it's a supply and demand problem, because I don't think that it's a case that, oh, well, if you don't write it, someone else will undercut you.
But I suppose it's also, I think what you're doing is so commendable, is that there's an absence of collective bargaining, right?
Yes.
That these are the freelancers, these are extremely unequal power relationships.
Yeah.
And so there are precedents for unionizing, really, if you look at, the writers' strike in America, things like that. But, when you put this set of, is demands the right word, together?
Asks, I would say, but
manifesto.
I've been very careful about the words I've used, but sure.
What is it? Red lines.
Yeah.
What was the response?
So it's had 1,000 signatures from both staffers and, I mean, it's obviously predominantly freelancers, but some staffers and sort of individual editors have signed it. I have had media bodies, so not media publications, but media bodies, get in touch to offer support and to sort of ask about how we can take this to the next step, which is to actually try and have these asks answered in some way.
Has anyone sent you a horse's head or menaced you in a...
No.
Okay.
No. I mean...
At the same time, has anyone actually offered to pay money up front?
There have been a few small publications who have said, by the way, we already do this, but
okay, I'm not sure. Had you said on air what your asks were?
No, I don't think I have.
Could you tell the listeners what the asks are?
Yeah, so it's an end to payment on publication.
And we'll put this in the show notes. So it's
great. So the first one is an end to payment on publication. So some kind of mechanism whereby at least half of the fee is paid on submission or upfront, which is something very typical in other self-employed industries.
/ all other industries.
Yeah, exactly. If you hire a builder, you pay half of the fee before the house is finished. And then it's...
And actually, if you write a book as well,
exactly. Yeah. It's an advance on payment. It's already something that happens in the publishing world. And then it's respective late payment fees. So there is actually a statutory right for self-employed workers to enforce a late payment fee if their invoice is overdue, and those payment terms are actually 30 days. So even though a publication might say, oh, my payment term, their payment terms are 45, 60 days, 90 days, the law actually says that you should be paid within 30 days. And if not, you have a right to a late payment fee, which is, there's a flat rate of £40 for payments under £1,000 and then £70 for invoices over £1,000 plus
in the UK.
This is only in the UK, plus interest, which is set at the Bank of England's interest rate and a little bit more, I think. I mean, the interest bit is pretty small. I mean, it's for each day that the payment is late. The interest is quite small, but obviously
take one of your children.
Yeah, exactly.
One finger.
But as I like to emphasize, this is not a fee that I have made up. This is the law.
Yeah.
And it's just ignored routinely by publishers. Anyway, and then the third ask is updating unfit for purpose payment systems. So as I alluded to before, there is so much red tape and complications with the actual payment systems themselves. Because they're just not set up either to
pay people.
Yeah, they're just not set up to pay people. So these also.
And it's not. I often think as well, like, it's not a financial transaction of inordinate complexity. We're not asking for like a credit future swap.
Exactly.
It's just a payment. And
there are now so many fintech companies and new methods of payment that actually there is another kind of. I read this somewhere that there is another school of thought, which is payment terms shouldn't be 30 days anymore, because 30-day payment terms were for when you were literally cutting a check and putting it in the post. In this modern world where you can pay people instantly and bank transfers no longer take 3 to 5 days, they are instant, payment terms shouldn't even be 30 days, but that's a future mountain to climb.
Do you think publications kind of deliberately pay people late to improve their cash flow position?
I'm trying really hard not to slip into a jaded school of thought that says yes. I wouldn't be surprised. I perhaps naively think it's because they don't realize the scale of the problem, and the problem is actually cut up into lots of different parts that happen in lots of different departments that are siloed and aren't talking to each other. And
as you say, like, editors are thinly spread and they have other responsibilities and stuff.
Exactly.
Like that.
I mean, to correct this problem would require a managing editor, heads of editorial and finance teams to come together and fix this. So I think that's also, going back to one of your earlier questions, like that is also one of the reasons that this problem exists. That being said, I wouldn't be surprised if actually, yes, some smaller publications or some publications that are really, really struggling with their own cash flow are maybe doing this as an active strategy on their part.
In terms of, next steps, I mean, it's interesting. My understanding is that at one stage the New York Times was sued by their freelancers in a class action suit, and they're now very good. Like, they have a system that functions and it's quick and things like that. Is your hope that the asks will produce answers, or is it time for direct action?
I think direct action is not out of the question, but I think it would be.
You need a graded escalation.
Exactly. I think. There are quite a few steps before something like that would need to happen. Again, because I think these asks are really, really not even that monumental, it would be a real shame if they require direct action to be met. I'm talking to a number of different organizations to figure out how to take this campaign to the next level and to start having the conversations with the decision makers at media companies and at publications. There's not a whole lot more I can say about it at this point, but I'm hoping that something will come of this. And I have a number of different ideas that I'm playing around with before we get to the
hostage taking stuff.
Exactly.
And what about the kind of other part, the events you've been organising, the panels? Could you tell us a bit about that?
So under my FJ&Co,
which stands for
Freelance Journalists and Company, but I never use its full name. Okay. It seemed like a good name to use at the time. Like
HSBC.
Yeah, exactly.
Rarely abbreviated to Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation.
Exactly. I think I need to kind of go back to the beginning, which is the week I got made redundant, I started writing a newsletter as a way to anchor my week and make sure that I had somewhere and a place to write, because at that point I didn't know what was going to happen, if I was going to get commissions. And so I started writing a newsletter, and it took a while for me to find my feet with it, but eventually I started actually just chronicling my journey as a freelancer.
And who were you sending it to?
So my initial list was pretty much just went through my inbox and, added all of my friends and people that I sort of knew in a professional capacity. And I said, I'm starting this newsletter. I'm not just going to add your name to this email list. If you are interested, sign up here. Here's the link. If not, have a nice day. And then I sort of tweeted it out. Initially, the readership was tiny, and it was really 90% friends and family, with kind of my parents replying to every email and that kind of thing.
And when did the graphics start?
Pretty early on, actually.
And who does them?
So a friend of mine back in New York called Leo Hamlin.
Okay.
She is a journalist, filmmaker, and illustrator. She's kind of moving into this graphics journalism space where...
That stuff's really cool.
Yeah, so she did this really great piece of BuzzFeed last year where she went down to the Texas-Mexico border and did this sort of series of postcards from the border where she interviewed Mexican immigrants who were being detained, I think, at the border. She told their story through these illustrated postcards. So anyway, so she does my graphics for me. She does a little cartoon for each issue, for each newsletter. And yeah, that started pretty early on. I don't pay her yet, but there are plans to pay her. Okay. Because at the moment the newsletter isn't making a direct income. So I do get quite a few commissions off the back of the newsletter, and I would say that in the grand scheme of things, it's sort of good for my brand.
Because some of these newsletters are now by subscription, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
people pay. I have actually moved onto a new platform called Substack, which is a platform for paid newsletters, and I will be introducing a paid version of the newsletter very, very soon. I was actually supposed to be launching it today, but I couldn't for technical reasons. So the announcement will probably be going out next week. But I will be launching a paid version of it, which in part is so that I can pay Leo, and also so that I can do more content and provide more resources for freelancers. Because actually the newsletter is now pretty much my favorite part of what I do.
What's your audience? How big is it?
2,500 subscribers. So it's a pretty decent amount. Basically, I got to the point where I reached the limit on MailChimp, and then they started charging me. And then it kind of felt ridiculous that I was paying to write a newsletter that I don't get paid for. Yeah. So I had to rethink about it. But anyway, as the newsletter grew and I started kind of growing this community around me of fellow freelancers, I was just being asked for kind of more information and sort of more resources and more help. And I realized that actually there's a really vibrant and active community out there. And contrary to popular belief, freelancers actually are not trying to kind of keep their work hidden from each other. They actually really want to collaborate and meet each other and share ideas.
It's not a zero sum, right?
Exactly. It's collegiate. So I decided to the next step was essentially sort of so the newsletter is a very one-way thing. I send it out and I do get quite a lot of messages back, but there's no interaction between the people who read the newsletter. So the events are pretty much a way to meet people in real life, but also to talk about very, very practical elements of freelancing. So I think you came to my finance panel. Yeah. So my aim with all of the events is that the audience should leave having learned something that will make their freelancing life easier, or help them make more money, or whatever it might be. It's supposed to be very, very practical, and it's supposed to have
Is it specifically aimed at women?
It's not.
Because I did have a look, and I could find you've had one male speaker, as far as I could find, who was an accountant, and
that is an active decision on my part to have
male accountants. Very wise.
No. To have, where possible, to have only female lineups, or at least majority female lineups. So I unofficially describe FJ&Co as a female-first community. So my priority is to make women feel comfortable coming to my events and to bring issues that are relevant to them. I'm not excluding men, but Anna's
making some pretty emphatic hand gestures while she's doing this.
I'm talking in my hands. I'm not excluding men, of course. That being said, I do also run meetups that are exclusively for female freelance journalists. Those are just networking events. But that's because there are issues that are unique in how they affect female freelancers. So I think, as you saw from the finance panel, how women negotiate is very different to how men negotiate. And sort of being able to feel that you're comfortable talking about that is something that's really important. Also,
and the attendance was mostly female as well.
Yeah. I mean, also, I think that's also probably, I guess that's just also a byproduct of the fact that I'm a woman myself and that I'm attracting a female audience. It's not something that it's not.
It's because you're creating a hostile environment.
I know, yeah, apparently. It's not, yes, it's not just for women, but it is something that I'm conscious of, and that I'm conscious to make women feel comfortable in that space.
What are the specific challenges you think women experience?
So there's the big one is the childcare and the maternity leave as a freelancer, because you don't have that. How do you balance if you want to be a freelancer and you want to have kids? How does that work? I have a lot of women write to me and say that they can't attend my events because they have childcare issues in the evening and it's really difficult for them. And balancing freelancing and being a working mom is really, really tricky. As I said, there's the negotiating your salary, I think also this is not necessarily so much about freelancers, but definitely something I felt. And what I love about freelancing is that as a woman in the workplace, I didn't realize this until I went freelancing. I just grew so tired of just the struggle of being a woman in the workplace and dealing with gender pay gaps in your salaries and feeling like you are being mansplained to and all of this kind of stuff. And actually it can feel very empowering being a freelancer as a woman, because you then just work for yourself and you don't have to deal with all of that nonsense anymore.
Well, Anna, thank you very much for being such a strident and excellent guest, and wishing you all the very best with the excellent projects going forward.
Thank you very much.
So, Ellie, thoughts on the Anna Codrea-Rado episode?
Well, I know you're trying to embarrass me because I haven't listened to it yet because I've been very busy
interviewing
partying.
rappers.
Well, not even interviewing them, just going to I went to Skepta's listening party yesterday.
Tell us about that.
I felt incredibly uncool, actually. Everyone was much younger than me, and I have a
you do have deep age-related anxiety. Yeah.
So no, it was fun, but it does mean.
How much older are you this week than from the last episode? 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah, you can tell it.
You're drying up
with my smile line here. Yes, so that's why I haven't listened to your episode, but I'm sure it's very good.
Potentially award-winning is how I would describe it.
Potentially.
Anyway,
not without me though on air.
So. No, this is true. I think I'll do a solo post-mortem of Anna. I think the work she's doing is really impressive and really important, and be interesting to see whether the industry kind of sits up and takes notice of it.
And as a freelancer, you have a vested interest.
I mean, I'm massively partial, usually biased. But good to have her on the show. We can also give some hints as to who's coming up on the show in recent weeks. We're going to have James Graham, the playwright, very exciting. Also John Lee Anderson from the New Yorker.
Who we just spoke to this morning.
In a weird podcast meta thing, we're now recording the extra for Anna, having just recorded John. He
was fascinating. He spoke all about it's a really good episode.
Anyway, very fascinating. Anyway, how's our banter? Slowly improving?
I think we must ban that word now. We've used it too much.
Okay.
And ban.
All right, we're going to end this now. This has been and that's the Frontline Club generator in the background, distracting us.
Featured heavily in the next episode.
Yeah. This has been Always Take Notes, presented by myself, Simon Acombe.
And me, Eleanor Hall.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. Our social media is by Zara Hankir. Our score is by Jess Stanheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
You can find us on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram, Always Take Notes. Please do rate, subscribe, review on iTunes if you enjoyed.
And think about giving us lots of money on Patreon, where we are at Always Take Notes. Many thanks. Bye.
Bye.